I never really wrote the books in response to any particular crisis or particular situation in the external world. I mentioned C. Wright Mills' sociological imagination. At the end of his book, he has an appendix called On Intellectual Craftsmanship, which I have kind of used as my Bible, my guide of how I go about doing my work. And a book for me is a report of the condition of my mind at a particular point in time when I can't stand it anymore, and I'm about ready to close that and move ahead. And so each one of them is kind of a report on my intellectual biography. That after I wrote the 76 book, you'll note I didn't write another book until 1990. I had a 14-year hiatus. I wrote a lot of articles, and I was chasing around a lot of little isolated, doing studies of what Mills would call limited milieu. I was just so excited about the idea of explaining some stuff that I couldn't explain using a sociological lens, and in those days, no one was doing it. No one was using sociology to look at the dynamics of schools. There are a lot of people who are writing about social class effects and schools. I mean, all kinds of sociologists writing about education. But other than Waller, no one really was writing about the sociology of the school, the sociology of the classroom, the social dynamics of schooling. Almost everything was written from a psychological perspective, but very little written from a sociological perspective. In fact, in that first book, Teaching and Social Behavior, I've got a whole section in there called The Psychological Bias of American Educators. And that was the first paper I ever delivered. By this time, I'd gotten my PhD at Ohio State. I'd moved from Versailles to Worthington and had gone back to Ohio State and took a dual degree in sociology and in education. And the two guys that I mentioned that supervised this, they were also on my doctoral committee later on, and they were kind of sponsors and advocates. And so I learned a lot from them over the years. Over time, I began to put all this stuff together, and eventually I came to writing that book, Teaching and Social Behavior. And Teaching and Social Behavior was intended to bring all this stuff together that I had learned from all these experiences, plus all the reading, into one book. And I thought it was going to be the book that everybody would read because this was so profound. And so I worked on it and worked on it and worked on it. And in it, it has a typology of 36 different types of schools. I talked about, and even then I was talking about bureaucracy, and I didn't use the word learning organization, I call them professional organizations. I said you got bureaucracy, and you got professional organizations, and then you got structurally tight and structurally loose organizations. There are some bureaucracies where the individual units have a lot of autonomy. That's structurally loose. There's those that are very controlled from the center. That's structurally tight. Then we have students as products, clients, and members. We said the school defines kids as product, clients, and members. And the type of involvement the kids have is moral, calculative, and alienative. And that was a typology. It gave me 36 different types of schools, and I spent time describing all those and so forth and so on. And I really thought, man, this is really profound stuff. Look at the title, Toward an Organizational Theory of Instruction. What I really was struggling with is, how do you account for the way school systems and schools affect what goes on between teachers and students in classrooms? And that's been my life question. I mean, that's the question I'm still asking. I think I have better answers than I had 40 years ago, but I still don't have a definitive answer. But if I was talking about a life-guiding question, it was, how does the way schools are put together, the way they're organized, the way they're managed, the way they're led, affect what happens between teachers and students in classrooms? Well, the 76 book, I think I've pretty well done that, but let me say a couple. That was really, that was a young assistant professor going to make it a grand mark on the world. And I was very fascinated with the question of how does the way schools are organized affect what happens to teachers and students in classrooms. And it all was an attempt for me it was really a book I was writing about what I was thinking. I didn't really have a clear audience in mind, yet I was the audience in a very real sense. I was talking to that young sociologist about what I knew about what sociology was teaching me about the way schools are put together. it's not, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I would love to go back and rewrite that book. And I came real close over here at the end with Leading for Learning. I still have some of the same themes in Leading for Learning that I had in that book. But I think it's more clear in Leading for Learning than it was there. Schools for the 21st Century. I had worked in the Gaines Academy from 1984 to 1990 or 1989. And that actually was written in about 3 weeks once I got at it. Yeah. And let me tell you how that happened. I went up, I'd been working on the ideas from 1984 to 1990. But I didn't really have an intention to write a book. And Bob Nolte, who works for us now, was at that time up in Connecticut, the director of what's called a RISA. It was called Rescue, and he was one of the directors of that. And he had me come up and spend a week in Connecticut with him. And in the course of that week, we traveled from various places. And in effect, I talked that book through with him on the highways in Connecticut. Well, I had not had a computer yet. I mean, I just got one. The gal in our computer department in Gaines had been asking me to get a portable computer. And I got all these ideas put together. And so I wrote from the front end to the back end of this thing, in the airplanes and any place that I was. I wrote that book in about 3 to 4 weeks. But it really wasn't a 3 to 4 week writing job. It was years, but it all came together at one time. And then you have to go back and rewrite it and so forth and so on. And that one I had to literally send to the publisher and talk them into publishing it, because I didn't have a publisher for it when I sent it off. That's when I came into contact with Josie Bass. The Inventing Better Schools was based on, I had developed that chart we call the WOW framework, I think it is, that 4-column chart. And I had developed that prior to writing Inventing Better Schools. And as I began to think about writing Inventing Better, about that chart, I'd give a lot of lectures around it and so forth. And almost I say, there's a book's worth there. You know, that C. Wright Mills stuff. I used to say that chart represented everything I knew about schools. That 4 columns. If you know what those 4 columns mean, you know everything I know about schools. And that book was an attempt to try to explicate that. Shaking Up the Schoolhouse, I suspect that's the closest to the most topical thing that I wrote. That is, it was inspired by some of the things going on around us, and talking about, if you read the end of it, I think there's a thing called the epilogue. I was getting very concerned about what was happening with charter schools and vouchers and so forth and so on, and the belief that if somebody didn't do something pretty quick, we were going to lose public education. And so that book was written more in that spirit. Working on the Work really goes back to Inventing Better Schools, but it goes more back to Marilyn Holman. Marilyn Holman is a former principal who works for us, and she was asking me all the time, working on the work ideas was catching on with a lot of people. We talk about designing work, and she kept saying, we need to have a handbook. We need to have a handbook. And I wasn't into writing a handbook. But she kept pounding on me and pounding on me and pounding on me, till finally I wrote that book. That book has sold more copies than the other 4 together. I mean, that book has sold about 180,000 copies right now, and that's unusual. When you think that there's about 3 million teachers, and of all the books that could be bought, I mean, that's an unusual sale for books. And I wrote it basically to satisfy Marilyn. Creating Great Schools really came out of a series of conversations we had in a variety of places that had to do with systems. And I had really written about those systems back over here before I wrote this book. I wrote a proposal many years ago to NIE, the Organization and Management Staff Development of Large Urban Schools, in which I had really talked about some of those 6 systems. I'd gotten those from Ron Corwin when I worked with him as a graduate assistant, and some of the ideas, and I try to signal that the Corwin's ideas really shaped some of that stuff, and I came up with those 6 systems and talked in more detail about those. The Leading for Learning was really an effort to rewrite that book, I think. Whereas I said, given what I've tried to write about back here and what I've learned in between there, what have I got to say about that subject again? And so that book was about that. Then engaging students really started out through the nagging of my editor about working on the work. And they wanted me to revise working on the work. Well, I didn't, I fussed with them for 2 or 3 years before I would do anything. Finally I said, okay, I'll try to write something for you. Well, I started, and I recognized that I couldn't revise it because there was such fundamental new learning and so many new things had happened that I had to write a new book. And they still wanted to hang on to the working on the work thing for marketing purposes. And I wanted to say, I said, the mistake I made with the working on the workbook, what people think working on the work is what it's about, is not about working on the work, it's about creating engaging work. And the working on the work framework, as I understand it now, as I would say it now, is really a heuristic device to help teachers design more engaging work for kids. But designing engaging work for kids is what it's about. For example, you're talking about this lady that teaches, that you all went to videotape. And you said to me, and I wasn't surprised by it, she probably uses the design qualities as much as you can possibly, and doesn't even know what they are. She's an intuitive designer of engaging work. She had, and her intuition, I think if she knew what the design qualities were and had the language, she probably could discipline her work more. I don't know that, I've never met her. The idea is it provides a discipline, and it makes it possible for teachers who are not likely to design engaging work to approach designing engaging work. But where I learned the stuff that led to working on the work really was by talking with and observing and listening to and reading research on great teachers. There are 3 chapters in that, engaging students, that are pretty similar to 3 chapters in this one. And that's advice for teachers, principals, and superintendents. There's some changes, but that is really revised. Those 3 chapters, I can say that's a legitimate revision. All the rest of it is a new write. Some of the themes are the same themes. But it's more about engaging students and less about working on the work. And it's more about engagement and how you create, because you need to focus on engagement.